Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First off, I'd like to thank the host and the organizers of the conference for inviting us and allowing us to share our country experience as it relates to the management of fiscal risks from the perspective of the Treasury. The discussion that I will present will mainly draw upon the previous work done with partnership with the World Bank and the IMF, including, of course, reference to a work done by our colleague, Mr. Richard Allen, from whose presentation I will also attempt to further flesh out the various practices that we have in the Philippines. So the approach will mainly focus on some core principles and then seeks to highlight what would be the parallel measures that have been initiated by the Treasury. So, going back to the basic question of what are fiscal risks. So, fiscal risks would pertain to potential deviations between the actual fiscal outcomes and those that have been used at the time of the forecast or the assumptions. And aside from macroeconomic shocks and the realization of explicit and implicit contingent obligations, the exogenous shocks would include your, as I mentioned, macroeconomic shocks. It would come from the profile of your public debt and the impact of, let's say, developments in the financial environment that would factor into your debt profile, as well as, of course, the huge task of managing the effect of natural disasters on your fiscal standing. When it comes to explicit contingent obligations, the government is, of course, exposed to the guarantees it extends to state-owned enterprises, as well as any undertaking that are undertakings which are part of PPP contracts. And when it comes to implicit contingent obligations, or those situations wherein the government has a moral obligation to step in, the government interventions would usually come in the form of interventions in the banking and financial sector, as well as subnational governments or subnational levels of government which enjoy a certain level of autonomy in the Philippines, as well as GOCCs, or what we call our SOEs, or state-owned enterprises. Now, the rationale for managing these fiscal risks would mainly arise from the fact that fiscal risk exposures are diverse, meaning they come from various sources or emanate from various sectors in your economy, and can be relatively large and also highly correlated, wherein the realization, let's say, of one risk incident can lead to a snowball effect that triggers other related risks. Also, what we have at least experienced in the country is that the identification, the disclosure, and the management of fiscal risks go hand in hand, in that once you begin to identify and acknowledge what are the vulnerabilities of the economy, there's also these natural effort on the part of the government to mitigate or to introduce reforms that will soften the impact of these fiscal risks. Lastly, the management of fiscal risks will seek to inform, as I said, the formulation of prudent macroeconomic policies and risk mitigation measures, which of course lends itself to long-term fiscal sustainability. So no doubt, the spillover of the health crisis into a fiscal and economic crisis for some countries also further justifies the aforementioned management of fiscal risks. Now, the role of the Treasury in managing fiscal risks mainly revolves around the core functions of a typical Treasury, which would be in asset and liability management. More specifically, the Treasury would be involved in cash and liquidity management, and in addition, the management of physical or non-financial assets, which would entail the provisioning for the impact of natural disasters and calamities. The Treasury is, of course, also tasked to pursue strategic debt management objectives as part of its mandate to finance the deficit and the budget. Finally, liability management can also extend to cover explicit contingent liabilities, such as those arising from government guarantees and public-private partnership contracts. Taking from a paper prepared by Richard and during, I think this will be a special issue regarding the COVID-19, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Cash management, or well, we're now moving into cash management, would mainly look into 4 pillars of modern, or the modern cash management centers on the interaction among 4 key pillars. Namely, first would be the consolidation. This would refer to the pooling of cash resources under a unified system of accounts to facilitate the transfer of resources as well as better oversight. Next is forecasting. This involves cash programming and the building of likely scenarios based on best available data. Next, we go to the management of cash balances. This will focus on maintaining adequate cash resources, including buffers, with due regard to costs and risks. And finally, what sets the foundation for this interaction will be the underpinning institutional arrangements that enables the smooth interaction of these functions among the stakeholder agencies. So we'll just look into what has the Treasury undertaken in terms of in each of these pillars to strengthen how it manages fiscal risks. Of course, when it comes to fiscal risks, cash management plays an integral role, since this will feed into, let's say, the financing requirement of the government and how it, let's say, manages short-term liquidity requirements. So the first step that the Philippines did in pursuing better public financial management was the institution of a Treasury single account. This was done in 2014, along with the necessary systems which we call the TRAMS, or the TSA monitoring system. So the TSA is, of course, a unified system of government accounts, which gives you a unified look into all of the cash resources available to the government. The Treasury single account, the TSA would include dormant and trust fund accounts. And this was instituted in 2014, as I mentioned, as part of the Public Financial Management Reform Roadmap. This will, of course, support better cash management, which would provide accurate and timely information on cash resources. As part of the initiatives to implement the TSA reporting and management system was also developed to provide the BTR a daily consolidated view of the cash position through a web-based application. Finally, just one of the guidelines in the adoption of the TSA was the shift or the removal of the float period for remittances of government collections, and moving towards a fee-based system which further enhanced cash management by providing updated cash balances, thereby avoiding the perceived shortfalls in cash, which would have led to overborrowing on the part of the Treasury. So the TSA, of course, has been developed over time, but in response to the massive funding requirement during the pandemic, the Treasury, as part, of course, of the overall fiscal management of the country, instituted a cash sweep and the reversion of otherwise idle balances. So this focused on pooling resources, which would fund the COVID response of the country, as well as the various welfare programs extended to the affected sectors. This generated nearly 100 billion pesos, 50 billion of which came from the sweep of cash balances which were held outside the TSA. Also part of the enabling law, which enabled this cash sweep, was to encourage state-owned enterprises to remit higher dividends than they normally remit to the government. In terms of cash forecasting, the Treasury has already implemented a high-frequency cash flow management committee meetings. So this was done even before the pandemic. Usually, the cash flow meeting would be done before the issuance of government securities, so that the auction committee, the ones in charge of awarding or issuing government securities, will be better informed about the cash requirements of the national government, as well as any developments in the horizon. The scenario building also made use of best available data based on historical trends, the cash program, as well as recent fiscal and financing performance. The cash forecasting also required better coordination with other government agencies, particularly in building the cash program. So to this end, a cash programming committee, which was composed of the agencies involved in revenue generation, budget management, as well as the top spending agencies, has been convened, I think starting 2014. This started from a initial group of around 10 pilot agencies, which have been expanded to include, I think, around 20 of the top spending national government agencies. Also, a more recent innovation or initiative of the Treasury was the establishment of a risk analytics strategy unit, which took on forecasting and analysis of factors relevant to the conduct of Treasury operations by applying quantitative methods and machine learning tools. So again, this aims to provide better quality data to inform our decision makers. Now, in maintaining or managing cash balances, key considerations, of course, would be the maintaining the cash balance in the TSA based on what was programmed, as well as the forecast of relevant factors, including prospective policy directions. An example of, let's say, how you should consider prospective policy directions, back in 2017, I believe there was already a message from the Fed, or the messaging from the Fed was that it would be unwinding, or it would be normalizing rates the following year. So the reaction from the Treasury then was to pre-fund its requirements for 2018, basically set up a buffer so that we did not have to borrow as much in 2018. And also, of course, we know that when the Fed has policy actions in the horizon, the markets tend to react in anticipation. So we were able to forego some of the effects of rising interest rates in 2018 because we were able to anticipate it in our funding operations in 2017. And also, the managing your cash balances also means bridging temporary cash shortages and maintaining buffers. This we experienced, of course, during the start of the pandemic in 2020, when the weak revenue generation as well as massive spending on the part of the government necessitated a huge sum which was not adequately programmed. So the Treasury initiatives in this regard would be well, of course, to recalibrate the provision. Well, this is something I think that would be not common among all Treasury units. We have what we call a bond sinking fund. Basically, this sinking fund is meant to, is where we draw when we service or for principal payments for maturing domestic debt. So previously, the sinking fund, the provisioning for the sinking fund was on an automatic basis. Once you issued a bond, whether it was 10 years, 25 years, or short term, you started putting cash into the bond sinking fund. What happened then was it inflated your funding requirement, even though you were not going to use it right away. So when we looked into the sufficiency of the bond sinking fund in around, this will be 2016, it was decided to switch to a more manageable approach of provisioning. You did not have to automatically start putting cash into the sinking fund, but instead we aimed to cover around 2 to 3 years of maturing debt obligations. So this was deemed to be sufficient in terms of our requirements. So this had the effect of lessening your funding requirement and, of course, your lessening your gross financing for the year. And this will be, the second measure here would be in response to the pandemic, as I said, to bridge the temporary cash requirements of the government and to provide a standby fund. We accessed liquidity support from the central bank. Initially, the central bank agreed or extended a 300 billion peso repo agreement with the Treasury, wherein they bought government securities. This was renewable for a period of 3 months, extended to 6 months. And then eventually, the central bank also extended 540 billion pesos in terms of provisional advances. This was done around October 2020, but paid by the end of the year. And then subsequently, it was renewed, but at a lower amount of around 300 billion pesos. The purpose of these provisional advances was to, again, provide liquidity support. It allowed us to manage our bond issuances, wherein we did not necessarily need to borrow, particularly when rates were rising. So it helped manage yields in our bond issuances because we were able to reject excessively high bids during our auction of government securities. So, as I mentioned at the start of the presentation, the cash management practices of the Treasury naturally feeds into the debt management function of the office. So, in managing the, let's say the primary mandate of the Bureau of the Treasury is to ensure that the financing requirements of the government is met at the lowest possible cost, consistent with a prudent degree of risk. So, for instance, for 2022, the government is poised to raise a total of 2.2 trillion pesos in borrowings. The financing requirements will be attained while ensuring the manageability of debt obligations through a responsive borrowing program that focuses first on domestic financing while taking advantage of strong market support to further diversify the investor base for government securities. These are just some considerations that have been built into the debt management strategy. Again, focusing on domestic financing, this will lessen or mitigate exposure to foreign exchange risk, as well as support local capital market development. We want to provide securities to the market to allow the efficient pricing of our yield curve and also support private sector borrowing. We have also diversified our external issuances, taking advantage of concessional financing from development partners, while also maintaining a presence in key markets with whom the country has significant ties, so as not to give rise to significant mismatches in currency. Also, we have widened our retail outreach. This will be the retail Treasury bonds program of the Treasury, wherein the initial investment has been, well, at least a lower initial investment is required, and this allows more individuals to participate in our Treasury issuances. This has, of course, the effect of mobilizing individual savings, channeling them towards the funding of government programs, and will, of course, promote financial inclusion. Lastly, as part of our issuances, we also pursue active liability management through bond exchanges. This aims to manage the maturity profile and, of course, lessen maturity risk by switching near-term maturing bonds for longer-term new issuances, which are usually also issued at a lower cost. Now, the question posed earlier as to how the Treasury reports its debt metrics or how it supports transparency in terms of fiscal risk arising from public debt. There are of course, the regular release of debt statistics and reports that we issue not only to the public but also to Congress or to the Senate to inform our legislators. But also in terms of the quality of the reports that we issue, we have of course taken advantage of capacity building assistance from IMF and the World Bank to come up with, let's say, a debt sustainability analysis wherein you are able to come up with a fan chart to at least reasonably project the trajectory of your outstanding debt obligations. And these debt metrics are reported or are included in our annual disclosure of fiscal risks in our fiscal risk statement. So just I think a brief summary of our history in terms of publishing a fiscal risk statement. It is an interagency effort among ministries engaged in budget, economic planning, finance, as well as the central bank. It started in 2011, again, as a result of technical assistance that we received. And the composition of the agencies involved in this initiative reflects the coverage or at least the risks that we report in the FRS. So we seek to provide a quantitative as well as a qualitative assessment of fiscal risks emanating from first, the accuracy of macroeconomic assumptions, the fiscal outturn or performance, debt sustainability or the assessment of public debt, the performance of the monetary, external, as well as the financial sectors, and also other contingent liabilities, which happens to be one of the major sources of contingent liabilities for the country when it comes to its exposure to natural disasters. Now, the Treasury serves as the secretariat for the initiative. Basically, we are the ones to consolidate the inputs from the various agencies and come up with recommendations as to what can be included in terms of forward-looking estimates, as well as the risk mitigation initiatives that they have implemented. So finally, this would also take from, not just from our own country experience, but also from related literature, I think way back 2010, 2009, as to the benefits of disclosure of fiscal risks. We found that it has the effect of increasing awareness of fiscal risk among stakeholders, not just the agencies that are involved in this initiative, but also those involved in the budget process, particularly our legislature. It also led to the crafting of responsive policies, which have allowed the country to overperform or at least meet its fiscal targets year on year, and to come up with prudent measures that contribute to the resilience of the various sectors, not just the banking industry, including, of course, our efforts to improve disaster risk financing, which has mitigated our exposure to natural calamities. Lastly, it has increased transparency and sound fiscal management, which has contributed to at least maintaining our credit rating among the credit rating agencies. In closing, I'll just leave a few notes or a few remarks, I think, which comes from our country experience, again, from publishing a fiscal risk statement. First, there is no one way to do a fiscal risk statement. It really depends upon the context of the country. What are the significant risks? We saw in the earlier presentation the heat map, wherein you take into account the magnitude or what is the projected fiscal impact alongside the likelihood of realizing those fiscal risks. Another thing, this management or this quantification of fiscal risk calls for the buildup of expertise to better quantify again or evaluate the exposure of the country. There's also a need to assess what needs to be covered and what to exclude. Examples of some limitations in terms of fiscal risk disclosure. You may be limited as to let's say, reporting the background of cases under litigation. You may also want to consider at least avoiding moral hazard problems by when the fiscal risk statement appears to be when it appears that the government is ready to intervene at every juncture. Lastly, the FRS or the fiscal risk statement remains a valuable tool in terms of messaging and getting the point across as to the management of fiscal risks. So I think that's the brief presentation from my country. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have later on. Thank you very much.